Today I'm going to be talking about 5 mistakes in landscape photography that if you don't learn to correct will eventually really bite you in the bum, and just by learning to avoid these 5 things you will become a better photographer over time. I mentioned in last week's video from St. Patrick's Day that I am going through my photo archives. I'm working through all of what I have stored on my hard drive to try and free up some space, and because there's a lot of out of focus and useless pictures on there that are not going to serve anything. So I am mainly focusing on my RAW files. You know, I do have a lot of JPEG files that I took before I understood what RAW was. But because RAW files have all of the data available, I can make adjustments and improve those images and bring a new life to them now that I know what I'm doing. However, going back to when I first started shooting in RAW, I have been amazed at some of the mistakes that I was making. So the purpose of this video is to go over 5 mistakes that I noticed in my old pictures and to show you how you can avoid them. Now, at the time that I took these pictures, I was often very pleased with what I was doing. I thought I was being like this amazing landscape photographer. Like, I was really happy with the results, but I wasn't really planning on doing anything with my pictures at the time. I didn't really process them or edited them in any way, and if you shoot in RAW and you don't process, it's like just drawing a pencil line and not writing, you know. It's completely flat, there's nothing there. So rather than a focus on editing and mistakes for that side of photography, these 5 mistakes are mistakes that I would make in the field, and which mean that the images are useless. And so it's something that I think will help you advance your photography. So I'm going to go through these from the least damaging mistake to the most damaging mistake. So we're going to start at the one that isn't too bad, you can work around it, to the one where you've really got to pay attention in the field. So without further ado, let's get started with number 5. And number 5 is not checking the edges of your frame. So when you're composing your shot in the field and you've got your camera, you need to be very aware of what's on these edges here. And to be honest, this is something that I still do now. I often get caught up in the moment with the light and everything else, and I'm just focusing on my subject so much that I'm not looking at the edges of my frame. I often just rush in and just start taking pictures, and that means that I end up having something out like this, so you can't see my hand, and that was an important part of me, and you just can't see it anymore. Or I will have just something random creeping into shot like this. And if I had paid more attention in the moment, then I could have got a cleaner, better image. And to be honest, this can happen for several reasons. Sometimes you're tired, you're not paying much attention, you're excited, or you're too wrapped up in getting the settings right that you're not actually checking your composition. And so it can be a really big factor. So I've got some example images. So this example image 1 is quite a nice landscape, nice light in these clouds over here. But this portion of the frame has been cut off. These boulders have been cut off here. If I had just tilted my camera a little bit, I would have had all of the boulders with a nice clean edge around it. There's nothing that was intrudes on that side of the boulders. It was just a lack of my position, and I didn't notice that I was just cutting off the edge of this boulders here. So this second image is a similar thing, but I just cut off this headland over here. I cut this headland off of the landscape. And if I had just tilted a little bit, I would have got the full part of the headland into the shot. And I've got an example of that. So you can see the difference, this shot here. In this shot, you can see quite clearly that I've got the headland in, and it's just making that landscape stand out a bit more and making it a lot easier to see. And if I hadn't cut off this piece of land here, it would have made for a nice shot, even in portrait orientation. And then the last one is this one. So this last image of checking your edges is very simple. You can see it straight away. I just didn't notice these trees. This tree branches creeping into shot. This is a vignette caused by the filters at the time up here, but it's these branches that I wanted to point out. If I had noticed, I could have just repositioned ever so slightly and got those branches out of shot. So it just helps to be aware of the sides of your frame and just keep an eye out for anything creeping in or cutting off when you're framing up your subject. Mistake number 4 is not having a clear subject in the frame. By that I mean you're taking a picture of a landscape, but why are you taking a picture of the landscape? What is it about that landscape that is interesting you, and what is it that's compelling you to take that picture? You know, I was looking through my photo archives and I came across several pictures where I was like, why did I take this? I don't know what I was aiming for. I can't even see anything that would make me say, oh, I want to take a picture of that. I was like, why did I take it? And you know, 6-7 years later, I don't remember why I decided, why I thought that thing was going to make a good image. These images are useless because there's no subject. There's nothing there. There's nothing of interest. And so you need to think about that when you're composing your shot. Identify what it is in the landscape that you want your image to be about, and create your image with that as the central component. So, you know, if you're taking a picture of the mountains and it's the mountain that is making you want to take a picture, you're not going to want a wide angle image because the mountain will appear super tiny in the frame like this. Whereas if you focus in and zoom in on that mountain, boom, it takes up the whole frame. It makes it more prominent and it makes it seem more interesting. Again, I've got some example images where I can't remember why I took the image, and as soon as you see these, you're going to be like, ah, I don't understand what you were photographing. For example, this one, example image number 1. I don't know what I was aiming for. Honestly, there's this big white gap in the middle, mountain's very far off. These 2 trees are cut off the branches, so they can't be what I was aiming for. I don't know why I would want these stumps. It's an image without a subject. It's an image without a reason. This next image is the same again. This was taken in Glencoe. I have no idea what I'm framing up. I've got boulders that have been cut off and destroyed all in the foreground, and then there's nothing in the distance, just white cloud, white lake. Nothing of interest. It's very boring and flat and there's no subject. And then this last image, again, is just a tree line on a shore. There's these branches sticking up in the foreground. Now, if I had thought about it a bit more, maybe I could have got closer, created a foreground with these, reduced the water and had the trees a bit more prominent, and then I might have had a good image, but it's boring. Nothing of interest. And as soon as you realize that, and as soon as you start identifying, oh, I wanted this part of the landscape to be what this image is about, you will instantly improve your photography because you'll be finding your subject and you'll be concentrating on it. Okay, mistake number 3 that I made a lot when I was just starting out, and that's underexposing my images. And this boils down to not understanding my histogram and fearing burning my highlights. Those 2 things combined to mean that I consistently underexposed my images. As I mentioned in my 5 tips to improve your photography video, you really need to understand how to read your histogram. It will drastically improve your exposures, more so than the light reading that is on board your camera, because there's a lot more information in your histogram to help you create a better exposure. Try not to worry about your highlights too much. Now, the reason that I fell into this trap is because I had heard so many times, like, you can't burn your highlights. You've got to expose for your highlights. You've got to make sure that your highlights are not completely white. And that means that I was often exposing 2 or even 3 stops under the light meters reading. And that meant that where a histogram should be nice and even, sort of in this range, I was bunching up all into the shadows region and everything was in darkness. And that's because I liked the way the highlights looked at that exposure, but it meant that I was losing a lot of information in the dark areas. Now this is all related to dynamic range, which is a very complicated subject, but it's to do with how the camera can process the dark and the light. Our eye has a dynamic range of approximately 24 stops, which means we can see into bright highlights and we can see into dark shadows, and our eyes and our brains can process information from both at the same time. A camera's dynamic range is often only limited to 14 stops, which means its range of light that it can interpret and understand is much smaller than what our eyes can see and understand. And this means that you can burn your highlights, or you can turn your shadows into complete darkness where our eyes would be able to see what's in those shadows or in those highlights. By permanently underexposing my images, I was really crunching those shadows down into almost black. And that meant that there was a lot less data for my camera to be able to record when I got it on the computer. So you might say, oh, if you've got a dark image, why not digitally increase the exposure or increase your shadows? Now you can do that for sure, but if it's too dark, the information is not there for the computer to understand what should be in those shadows. Let's look at some examples. Okay, this image here is from Glencoe, and you can see it is very heavily underexposed, about 3 stops underexposed, I would suggest. And that was probably because of the highlights in the water and in the sky up here. I was trying to make sure I didn't burn that data away. Now, if I increase the exposure digitally, I can get something a bit more balanced. It's a bit bright because I haven't balanced the highlights, but to show you, okay, I've got information in the shadows. You can see all the detail and the rocks clearly. However, if we zoom in on this area of the rocks, you'll soon notice a lot of color and noise produced by the camera. And you can see it in this image here. There is a lot of blue and red tinging, and that's where the shadow has distorted the camera's understanding of what colors there are in there, and it's introduced noise. And it's the same again in this image here. This could even be 4 stops underexposed. It's another frame that I showed earlier with the trees creeping in, but this is 3-4 stops underexposed, very heavily dark. So we do the same again, we brighten up. Okay, I've got my detail more or less back, but if I zoom in on this area of the grassy sedge heather there, horrible color noise, lots of reds, blues, banding, greens, all over the place because the camera doesn't know what to put where. And the same again in this image from Canada. I've underexposed by 2 or even 3 stops. So I brighten it up much better. I've got most of my detail. It looks okay until I zoom in. And then there's this, I've lost all detail in these trees, and there is a lot of fringing and chromatic aberration and just color noise. And that's why you should really avoid underexposing your images and try and expose as brightly as you can whilst not burning out your highlights and overexposing your highlights. So it's really about creating that perfect trinity of settings to get everything the way that you need it to be. Moving on to mistake number 2. Now this is where we're getting into irreparable damage to our images, and this one is using cheap neutral density filters. I know. It's not most people might not even think about this as an issue, but it was an issue that I had. So if you're just starting out in landscape photography and you're not sure if you really like it, it might seem a bit daunting spending £100, £150 on a single piece of glass to use for your camera. However, if you do go the cheaper route, it can irreparably damage your images. So if you want to try out filters without investing in them, I would really suggest trying to get in contact with a friend or someone at the photography club, or even ask a guide if you're going out on a one-to-one photography experience, if you can try their filters out, and you can see what you can do with those filters without buying them first. But if you do go the cheap route, then be aware that you might end up ruining your images. So let me explain why that is. So I consider filters to be an essential part of a landscape photographer's kit, especially two of them. Okay, you can do away with graduated filters. To be honest, you can recreate that in Lightroom as long as your highlights aren't burnt out. But there's two filters that I would always carry with me if I'm going anywhere near water. And that is a polarizing filter, which helps to stop glare and reflection coming off of water and anything with a reflective surface. It just helps to bring it back into detail. And a 6-stop neutral density filter, solid neutral density filter. And that is so I can slow my shutter speed down and slow down the exposure for water entering the scene. So if I'm going anywhere like a waterfall, a river, or a coast, I want that 6-stop filter in my bag. So those two filters I consider to be essential because it's really difficult to recreate those effects in post-processing or without the filters. For years, I used just a cheapo set of filters from Amazon. I think it was like 30 quid for the entire set, including stop rings for every lens imaginable and everything else. It had not only neutral density filters, but color filters like red, green, blue, which is for black and white photography. And if I was going to do black and white photography and I wanted those color filters, I would use that cheapo filter set, no problem. They will not damage the images. If you want a color and a black and white version, then it will, because you'll just have a red image if you put on a red filter, which I did for fun when I first got the set. But the cheap ND filters that came in this set are what I had problems with in post later, and it's really difficult to fix now because they gave all of my images a very horrible and noticeable color cast. And that means they're not really neutral like they should be. They're giving a horrible purple or magenta tinge to my images where they should be grey. And that's where buying an expensive set of filters prevents that, because Lee, Case, Nikki are some brilliant filter manufacturers, and they have worked really hard to get that neutral color. So let's take a look at some example images. The biggest annoyance for me about using cheap filters is the fact that I was traveling a bit at the time, and now all those images from amazing places in the United States and Canada are completely ruined by having this horrible purple tinge that's really difficult to remove. For example, this image of the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco, although I know it's a bit wonky, but there were others in the sequence and I was on a boat at the time. But you can see like this purple color to the sky. Now I could try and reduce the purples in the HSL slider and do loads of other stuff to try and remove it, but it's really difficult to do, and it will still not look right because there will be some sort of damage to the image. Same again with this one from Canada. Horrible purple tinge to the top of the sky. I was using a graduated filter because it was very bright. And then this one, I was using I think it was a 6-stop or something like that to smooth out the water. And the tree here in the foreground has a purple hint, the water has a purple hint, the sky has a purple hint. And that was, I've tried to correct it using the eyedropper, HSL sliders and everything else, and the colors just go completely out of whack and it looks really bad. So, you know, the image is not brilliant anyway, and with that color cast it's just useless. So I do recommend, if you're going to invest in filters, rather than investing in a cheap set, realizing they're crap and buying a more expensive set, go straight for the expensive set. It will save you a lot of headaches later on. So the mistake number one to avoid, which is quite funny, and I imagine most of you are not making this mistake, but I made it horribly several times, and that is not protecting your camera gear from the rain. It's an obvious one, but you know, a lot of these higher end DSLRs, they say, oh, we're weatherproof, we're weather sealed, you can throw us in the water and we'll still work fine. Don't believe it, don't believe it. In 2018, I went to a black grouse lek to photograph the birds during their mating ritual in the more early hours of the morning. It's a common thing in Scotland, and I was really super excited about going to this lek. I was hoping to get some really dramatic images of male black grouse fighting and the hens running in amongst them, and you know, it was just something that I never thought I would be able to do. And so I was super excited about this. Now for a black grouse lek, you have to go in the early hours of the morning. I'm talking like 1, 2, 3 o'clock in the morning. In the dark, you have to walk out to the hides and get set up before the birds arrive. And so you're sitting in the dark for 4, 5 hours waiting for these birds to start showing. So when we arrived, it was raining hard, and I mean hard. Everything was horribly soaked, and I didn't have a camera bag big enough for my big 500mm lens. So I just had it mounted on my tripod and I had it over my shoulder, and I was like, okay, this is okay, this will work. It's weather sealed. So we went to the hive, sat down, got everything set up, and we were waiting for the light to come. This was hours of sitting in the dark, and then you just hear these wonderful otherworldly noises as these black grouse burble in the lek. It's an amazing noise, and it's something that everyone should hear, because it is really, really strange to hear in the complete darkness. The light was just starting to come up, and the birds were making these wonderful noises. I could see them, but it was still a bit dark for the camera. I ended up taking a couple of images just to test it, and then camera switched off completely. I thought nothing of it. I just flipped the switch on and off, and it came back on. I carried on taking a couple of images, and then all of the black grouse left. They all flew off. No idea why. And if they leave at around 7 o'clock in the morning, they're not coming back for the day. That's it. That was your show. So I was a bit disappointed that the black grouse just decided to leave. We saw a buzzard flying around over the forest, and we think it might have scared them off. You know, that's a part of wildlife photography. You know, I was hoping to have another opportunity in a few days. No big problem. As I was leaving the hide, I propped my camera up on the ground, and then it just fell over into some wet, heavily wet moss. It was only there for like 2 seconds as I quickly grabbed it up and carried on, and we made our way out. Later that day, I switched on my camera and I went to take some pictures of another bird, and then gone, switched off, and it would not turn back on. So I sent it off to repairs. Turns out that some water had got in and fried the motherboard completely. I had to replace the whole motherboard of the camera, and the repairs cost me more than £500 to repair this camera. And the guy told me that although they're weather sealed, there can be gaps in that weather sealing during production, and that's what's the case. So he put in some extra weather sealant in those gaps, and he said that should be the case. But since then, I try and take it a bit more seriously and use covers when I can. So the two lessons from that story is, one, try and protect your camera gear from the rain, and two, get insurance so they can pay for the repairs. There is another reason that you need to protect your gear from the rain, and it's a little less dramatic than your camera breaking. And you noticed this when I was in Glen Affric a few months ago. I was using my lens cloth to put over the front of my camera while I was setting up the shot so that the rain wouldn't get on the filters. That's the reason why, because if the rain gets on your filters, your images are ruined, and I've got some examples where that is what happened. So this image here from Glencoe, and you can barely see the landscape. There is so much rain on this front element here. I mean, it's amazing how much rain got on it. And then this one, same again. Lots of rain. It was a very windy day and it was just driving the rain right into the front of the camera. And then this one, although the image is absolutely awful and I'm not really sure what I was taking a picture of, you can see all this rain again on the front end. And there's just no way of removing that in post. Now, like if it's one drop, okay, maybe spot remover or content aware fill in Photoshop could deal with it. But when there's so many such as this, it's just an impossible task to remove them all. It's just not worth it. So that's why you need to protect your camera gear from the rain, using something to cover the front element while you are setting up, wiping it down repeatedly, removing any raindrops. And then when you come to take your image, you should get a much better, clearer example. So that's it. To summarize those 5 mistakes: number 5, not checking your edges. Number 4, no clear subject. Number 3, underexposing your images. Number 2, using cheap ND filters. And number 1, not protecting from the rain. If you avoid those 5 mistakes, you'll be doing much better than I was several years ago. If you've liked today's video, don't forget to hit the thumbs up. And if you want to see what's coming up next week, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. I'm not really sure what's going to happen next week. I haven't really planned ahead this far, but hopefully it'll be a bit of fun. Thank you very much for sticking around in this rather long video. I didn't realize it was going to be this long, but I'm really thankful that you have watched to this far if you have. I hope you take these lessons to heart and you improve your photography. As always, get out and enjoy what you can, and in the meantime, I'll see you on the next one.